Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Sincere apologies for the delayed start. Of course, internet crash just as I'm about to go online, so I'm very sorry if you're waiting for me. You are very welcome to this talk on preparing for an audio recording as part of the Music Network Taking Charge of Your Performance Career series. I'm Laoise O'Brien and I'm a music producer, and I'll tell you a little bit more later on what that entails. I first gave this talk alongside my colleague Owen Brady in the Music Network offices in Dublin last November. And we had a really interesting group of musicians from diverse backgrounds in the room with us. And we had lots of interesting discussions and chat about recording and various experiences of recording. But we were looking at a very different future back then. And obviously, I'm here at home in Kilkenny. And I guess if you're watching this, you're probably at home, and it's very strange for us all not to be out performing and teaching and recording, and it's hard to know what next week will bring, really, never mind next month or next year. But this is an opportunity this time, I think, to do some planning and maybe to take some projects off the long finger. And one of the things that might be an idea, if you are thinking about it, is to plan a recording, because it does take some time. I would be kind of cautiously optimistic that we might get back to some kind of recording in the months ahead. It's great to see live streaming of concerts happening. There's some really great stuff happening out there, and lovely to see such great quality material coming out. So I would be kind of hopeful. I imagine large ensemble things won't be happening for a while, but maybe smaller things, solo projects and small groups might be possible. We'll cross our fingers. So the first thing I want to say to you about recording music is that there's no one approach or best approach to it. It really very much depends on what you're recording and who you're recording, or the sound you want to get, and also the different techniques that engineers use. What I'm going to present to you today is based on my own experiences and things that I've learned or picked up over the years of doing this. Now, I mostly work with classical music and traditional and folk. They're the genres I would be working with. And within those, I mean, that's a very broad range. Within that, I mean, I could be working with a choir one day, and the next day it could be a singer-songwriter, and then I could be in a string quartet. So it's quite diverse in itself. I suppose the main point is that it's acoustic and that the musicians are, well, in a room together, which would be lovely. But I also would work, if I'm not in a studio, I'd be working largely on location, so in a church or a hall or something like that. Now, a lot of what I am going to say might seem really obvious, but sometimes you need to state the obvious. And I found that with musicians, myself included, that until you go through the process of making a recording, you don't really know what goes in and out. My own experience was that I would just turn up for a session, do my bit, thank you very much, and then a few months later I'd be handed the CD and go, oh, sound great, and not realizing all those steps that have had to happen to make me sound, as good as I could have sounded. So I think it's good to maybe just the approach I'm going to take really is imagining somebody is making a CD, because it's probably the most, or an album, it's probably the most complex thing that you would do as a musician. And if you other forms of recording, like recording music for video or making content for radio or theatre, for example, a lot of these principles will apply. But because it's the most complicated thing with the most amount of steps, I thought I would imagine a scenario where somebody was coming to ask me for some advice on how to go about making an album. So that's how I'm going to approach it. Today, I'm going to look at the steps leading up to a recording session, and then on Thursday, I'll explore what happens during and after a session. Please feel free to send me on any questions or to add your own experiences or insights into recording. I'd just like to point out that I am not a recording engineer, so I wouldn't be so great at asking questions about microphones and things like that, but there are plenty of great engineers out there, and my experience is that they really like to talk about technical things. So maybe if you have access to an engineer, you could have a chat with them about microphones, and hopefully I won't get irate messages from the engineers of Ireland. Sorry. Now I'm going to just pull up my PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully that'll come up now. Here we go, lovely. Phew. And I'm going to talk you through this now, preparing for an audio recording. So the first thing I wanted to say is, what are you hoping to achieve with your recording? Is it your intention to get your music on radio? Are you looking to get your music reviewed, get some gigs? Are you looking to make music specifically to put on social media, make a music video, or have you something specific that you want to do or say? And it could be actually that you want to do all of the above. If it is a thing that you're looking to get your music on radio, get it reviewed, get some gigs, you are probably talking about an album, really, be it digital or physical. But that's what you're looking at there. And then maybe music for social media or music video, which could be one of the same. That could also be part of your album project. But the reason why I would suggest that you think about what you want to do is that the approach you would take to doing the recording would help inform your people, your engineer and your producer, how to go about making that recording for you. So just to have the idea in your head, I think is a good idea. Let's talk now about, hold on, types of recording. So people make recordings for all kinds of different reasons. And these are just some of the examples that I would have come across just from doing it. Sometimes people want to record a specific body of work. That's very self-explanatory. You might decide you want to do Mozart piano sonatas or something, and that's fine. You may want to make a recording that demonstrates your abilities. Not to say that the first one doesn't demonstrate your abilities, but I think with a recording like that, it's more you've more flexibility in your repertoire choice, because you might want to be showing off your brilliant technique or your beautiful tone or your amazing voice. And with a specific body of work, you have to record that. You can't leave out a movement of a sonata because it's not going so well. Whereas when you're doing a recording that's more flexible, like something that's showing off your ability, you could discard things or you can add things as you go. An archive recording is another popular thing that people would like to do. That could be tied into an academic project as well. You know, it could be tied into a book or some project that you're doing. I like those recordings a lot, actually, especially if you're recording material that hasn't been recorded before, or is particularly maybe music of a particular region, something like that. And the next one that happens sometimes is a recording where you play and see what comes out. Not so common. It happens more with kind of improvisationary music, and that can be really special. You know, you put a group of musicians in a room together and you see what happens. The one thing I wanted to say about that in relation to that is the chemistry in a recording is really important. I mean, you can put brilliant musicians together and not necessarily get a brilliant recording, because you know yourself from playing and from being on stage, you have to have that bit of chemistry as well. But those kind of recordings can be an interesting thing to do. Sometimes ensembles or bands or something will do that. They play together all the time. They want to see what comes out in a studio session. Passion projects would be another one. And these kind of projects are when people have something that they really need to do or say or get out of them, and maybe not necessarily for commercial purposes or, you know, for anything other than the expression that they need. I mean, I've done that myself, you know, a few days in a nice location, good musicians, just to work out some things that I needed to work out. So yeah, they can be interesting projects to do as well. And I just wanted to bring up EPs at this point, because an EP, so like a short recording of 3 or 4 tracks, maybe sometimes musicians might need to do that because perhaps they're looking for some funding, or they might possibly be looking to get a record deal or something, and they just want to show a sample of what they can do. What can happen sometimes is that musicians can say, I want to come and do a couple of tracks. It'll probably take an hour. Actually, there won't be any editing to do. Well, it'll take longer than an hour. There will be editing to do. And the setup that you need for getting 3 or 4 tracks is the same setup really as you have for any recording. So sometimes the cost of making an EP can be almost as much as making an album. So I'd say to people, if you've purpose for it, great. And if not, maybe think about waiting until you have the repertoire to do a full recording, I think. Now, planning for a recording. These are the main things that we're going to have a look at. We have concept, which I've dealt with a little bit, costs, the personnel involved, the venue, preparation, and a time frame. So I'll look through these different areas now. Concept. So like we had a bit earlier about, you know, thinking about what kind of recording you want to do, it's good to know what your concept is and have it well thought out. Now I don't want to take the magic and the mystery away from recording, because, a lot of magic can happen in a recording studio or in a recording location. But anyone who's been on a recording session will know that it is a little bit clinical. It's different to performing, because when you're on stage performing, you're expressing yourself in an outwardly way. Whereas in a recording situation, you are still expressing yourself, but it is in a slightly more controlled way, because you need to have your best possible version of yourself technically, and also you're not getting anything back like you would get back from an audience. So it's different feeling altogether. Be organized, plan every detail, know what you want. I would advise having a notebook or maybe a few folders on your computer, that as you go, as you're planning, as you're thinking about it, because it can take a while for it to work out in your head, just jot things down. Also really good for other people involved in your recording to have an idea what's going on, so that you have a plan and that you know exactly what's happening. And then I would say research what is out there. Can you compete? So if you decide you're going to do something like maybe record Goldberg variations or something, is your recording going to be able to compete with what's already out on the market? I mean, maybe it is. Maybe you are a virtuoso and it's going to be the best recording ever. Or maybe the market's already saturated. So it's good to kind of have a look at that. You might possibly need an angle or maybe have an approach of something that's a little bit different, just to get your recording noticed. And so a bit of research, I think, is a good idea. Now, I'm going to deal with the costs, because, well, it's kind of the biggest thing you need to think about, because it is an expensive business. It is an investment. I think it's true to say that not many of us will make money from the recording itself. What you get from the recording is opportunities and hopefully some gigs and lots of benefits of having a recording. But and you will always sell, if you have a CD, you'll always sell them at gigs. It's brilliant, actually. Or you might sell a few online. But it's good to have a look at the costs before you go into it. And these are some of the costs that might come up, and this applies for recording an album or indeed recording anything. Your biggest cost is going to be the cost of hiring an engineer and maybe a producer. And really, they are the person who are the people who do the most work. And it's not just a few days that you spend in the recording session, it is also all the prep leading up to it, and then all the work that has to be done afterwards, the editing, mixing, mastering, all that kind of stuff. So if you were to sort of work it out in a day rate, it's really not a huge amount. So it's understandably probably the biggest cost. The second one is paying other musicians. Now, this is a kind of a tricky one, because we all, as musicians, we love to play and we do each other favors, and there isn't a musician out there, I don't think, who hasn't done a favor for another musician and played for them. I would kind of, and this is really my own personal opinion, I think it's a good idea to pay the musicians on your recording, because I think as a community we need to, it's an onus on us really to expect to be paid for our work. And even if they're your best friend or your cousin or whatever, like, and you can buy a voucher or do something. The flip side of it, I think, is that if you don't pay a musician, and then if you were to go on and have huge success with your recording, maybe it got picked up by somebody and you ended up doing very well out of it, it might feel a little bit uncomfortable. So it's or maybe have a chat. Contracts might be something to consider, but do think about that. Now, if you're recording in a studio, oftentimes the venue or the studio will come with an engineer, or an engineer will come to the studio. If you're going into a location to record, like a church or a hall or something like that, then there could be a hire for that. You may also have to pay for heating and that kind of stuff, so consider that. If you have an instrument you need to hire, that's another cost. For example, a piano. Yeah, you might have to hire a piano. And if you are hiring a piano, make sure that you hire a piano tuner. It's very important to tune the piano. And if your recording is piano heavy, like it's a solo piano piece or piano sonata or something, have your tuner on standby, so that you don't. It's like if a note slips or something and you can't get hold of the tuner, your recording could be held up. So good to have them there tuned but on standby. You may have to hire or purchase music. Then you have the cost of reproduction if you're making a physical recording, or you might have the cost of having to put something up online. So there is a cost there. Graphic design, again, something I'll deal with on Thursday, but that is making your CD look lovely, or designing your image for your album cover or your virtual album cover. You may have to pay for artwork. So if you are getting an image from somewhere, it has to be paid for. It's another factor. Photographs, if you want to get good new publicity photographs. And if you're hiring in somebody to do video for you, that is another cost. You may have to pay royalties. If your music is within copyright, then you have to pay royalties on those. And then there may be promotional costs, like maybe taking an ad out in a magazine or getting an ad on Facebook or something like that. And then launch costs. So if you've got the trouble of making a recording, it's a nice idea to have a launch. It's a lot of work, and it's, you put a lot of yourself into it. So nice to have something at the end of it. It's also a great opportunity if you are wanting to sell some of your CDs, because people tend to be very generous and they might buy a few copies. So it's a nice opportunity. And also for publicity, it's great to have a launch. So they're the kind of main costs you need to think about. I'm not going to give you a ballpark of how much costs to make a recording, because it's how long is a piece of string kind of situation. They can be incredibly expensive, big projects. But all those factors have to be put in to your recording. So let's talk about the people who are involved in the recording. You can have the best musicians in the world. You can be the best musician in the world. You can have beautiful artwork. You can do everything really well. But the most important thing in your recording, and any recording that you're doing, is that it sounds good. And therefore, you need an engineer who you are happy with and you work well with. And there are lots of engineers, and they do different things. Some engineers like to specialize in live sound, and some engineers specialize in recorded sound, and some engineers are also producers. And within that, they might have specialties that they like to do, but they are ultimately responsible for the sound. And I suggest that it's a good idea to become a little bit critically aware of sound of recordings, and listen to recordings, and maybe look at who the engineer was. And like, they have their own sound, like an instrumentalist or a singer would have their own sound. An engineer has their own sound. You can also maybe have a chat with your engineer about the type of sound that you want, and maybe you can refer to some recordings and then have a chat about what microphones or what approach you'd use to get that sound. The engineer does all the technical setup and recording during the session. That's their job. They could also do the editing and the mixing. And the mastering engineer may be a different person. And some jobs require a number of engineers. So I'll talk about what those different stages are on Thursday. But you could have the one engineer for the whole job. You may decide, or maybe the engineer decides, that it's good to have a new fresh set of ears at the mastering stage. And if you're doing a big job, like, say, for example, an orchestral job, you will possibly have 2 or 3 engineers, because there are various things that they need to be doing at the same time. So yeah, that's what the engineer does. Very, very much in a short amount of information there. Loads more to it. So the question is, do you need a producer? And I guess the short answer to that is no. You could produce your own albums. I've done my own, and I am a recording producer, so I don't really want to be doing myself out of a job. But I'm going to outline now what a producer does, so that you can decide if it's something that you need for your recording. So here you go. The producer is an external, impartial pair of ears who can bring objectivity to a project and can help to ensure that the recording goes smoothly. The producer can guide musically, in addition to listening out for technical issues such as ensemble, intonation, rhythmic accuracy, etc. The producer will project manage a recording, and it is the producer that you are liaising with from initial contact through to finished recording. The producer also ensures that a recording keeps on track and that everything is covered in the allotted time. For classical recordings, you need a producer who can read scores and has a well-rounded knowledge of the repertoire. The producer will often also edit the material. If you are doing your own producing, then be sure to keep good notes. You may end up with over 20 hours of material to sift through, so want to have noted where the good takes are. Recording can be a stressful experience, so there's a certain amount of psychology involved in ensuring that everyone stays cool, and it is the producer's job to manage expectations and bring out the best in the musicians. And just about that last point, sometimes it is, stressful. You're putting an awful lot of yourself into your recording, you're exposing yourself, and it can get tense, and there can be tension between the musicians. And I think the producer is the person who needs to know when to step in that situation. And sometimes the producer needs to actually back off, and you might need to have a little moment. Sometimes I need to have a little moment, like when the internet doesn't work. But yeah, that's a large part of the job, to make sure everybody is comfortable and that everybody gets on. The point I made there about the importance of classical music being able to read score, I think that is true of every genre. It's good to have a producer who understands the language that you speak. So if it's a complex, I mean, if you like, I'll take classical music as an example. So if it's a complex piece of music, then the producer needs to be able to read that, interpret that, and then discuss it with you in a language that you both understand. Similarly, if you're doing a jazz recording, the producer needs to understand the language of jazz. So yeah, that's something to consider. So the question is, do you need a producer? No, but I would advocate for one, because if you have an engineer and a producer on a job, then the engineer is responsible for the sound and is looking after the sound, is solely focusing on the sound, whereas the producer is looking at all the detail. Now, as I said earlier, that could be one and the same person. That's grand. But having somebody who's keeping an eye on these aspects of the recording is also useful to have as well, unless you're doing it yourself, of course. So let's look at a venue. Studio recordings are great. Studios are a good controlled environment, and you know what you're doing, and the engineers know their studios and they know what they're going to do. For a lot of music, it can be nice to record in a venue like a church or a hall. You know yourself, if you're playing, you get a bit of a bounce back off the walls in a church. It's very nice. So if you're the person who is looking at the venue and choosing a venue, there's some things to consider. Now, I'm saying this assuming that we're all going to get back to doing this at some stage. So things may have to change. We're going to have to see what happens with the whole COVID situation. But in a normal world, these are the things to look for. So you need a good acoustic that's not too dry and not too reverberant. I would advise to go and sit in the venue, sit down, have a listen, see if there's any noises inside and out. So external noises, especially say if you're in a city or a town, you're looking out for things like the tram or traffic lights or things like that. I mean, you can't control every noise. You really don't. Half an hour ago, there was someone mowing a lawn outside. But, you can listen out for things that are repeated, like, the traffic lights. Turn on the lights, and if you're going to be using the heating, turn it on to see how noisy it is. It's unbelievable how noisy lights are. They click and they fizz, and sometimes they hum, and that's the worst, because if they're humming in the wrong key, you do your head in. Listen out for overhead planes if you're under a flight path. Again, I'm saying this now, knowing that there are very few planes in the sky at the moment, but it is something to think about. You need power for the equipment and heating for yourself if it gets cold, especially if you're going to be sitting in the same place for hours on end. You could be freezing. So think about that. Now, here's a really important one. Is there access for the engineer to park and get gear in? So the engineer will have a load of stuff, cables and all kinds of yokes that have to come in. That's a technical term, all kinds of yokes. But they have to be able to get in, and so they need to be able to park as close to the entrance as possible. If your venue is up a load of stairs, how are they going to get it in there? Maybe you need help. Maybe you need to arrange for a few pals to come and give you a hand out getting the stuff in and out. You need a bathroom. That's very important, especially if you're in the countryside. And I have turned up in churches with no bathrooms, and that's a problem. You might need to bring extra lighting, maybe lamps, sand lamps, and it's a really good idea to bring food and drink. Especially if you're in a place where you're quite far away from a cafe or something, because you'd lose a lot of time going out to grab a cup of coffee. So good to bring that. Musicians will play better because they'll be happy. Your engineer will engineer better. You'll have a happy producer. Producers are always happy. So some of the things to think about, and maybe other people will have ideas of things that I have forgotten there. Now, so your preparation, you want to book your engineer and producer, if using one, between 6 and 12 months in advance at least. Yeah, that's a good bit of advice, because they could be very busy, or if you're planning that far ahead, it's the first step that you take. Decide on a recording venue if you're the one doing this. That's not so crucial because you have up until the time you record to sort that out, but be thinking about it or be talking to your team, and they might have suggestions of places to go. Booking musicians well in advance, especially if they're touring musicians. I know, but still, and plan rehearsals. Yeah, this is a very important point because you want to, sometimes you go into a session and you're sight reading, that can happen, that's fine, but it can take up the time. You don't have all the time uh, to do the recording. So I think it's a good idea to have rehearsal in advance if you can. Prepare scores, set lists, and send on to the producer. Yes, please, bound if possible. Write your set list on the back of an envelope, not that that has ever happened to me. Work out the keys, orchestration, and any other practical issues. So, for example, if you have a guest singer on the recording and they're singing only on 2 songs, program them beside each other. That's just like a simple thing, but obviously, so they're not hanging around all day. And check singers as well. They often don't like to sing in the morning, so that's something to check out. Those kind of practical things. If you're playing in the same key, if you're doing a set of pieces in one key and then you're moving to another key and there's an instrument that needs to retune, that's going to take a bit of time as well. So those kind of practical issues. Speak to the engineer about how much time they need to set up and strip down. Yeah, it takes a long time to get set up for a recording. A big orchestral job can take a day or a couple of days. For most jobs, it could take up to half a day really to get it sorted. Make a recording plan with your producer or with yourself. Make a recording plan, and you can, that's a movable feast. You can move that around depending on what you're doing, but it's just good to know sort of where you are day by day. And then a time frame. So planning should start 12 to 18 months in advance, I would say. So now's a good time if you're planning for something next year. Recordings can either be done in a continuous block or in separate blocks. The more days you have, the more expensive it'll be. Now, on that point, ideally you would do your recording all in one block of a couple of days, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, for whatever reasons, you have to separate them out. But what's really important to remember is that the setup is going to be the same for the engineer every time. So if you are coming in on Monday morning, you have a 3-day session, and they're coming in Monday morning, is really going to be lunchtime before you're going to be doing any recording, I would say. And then at the end, they have to strip down. So that eats into the time. So the more times you have to do that, the more expensive it's going to be. And also to watch out for things like if you're recording in a church and it's a functioning church and they have services or mass, you may have to move stuff out of the way and put it back in, which is not brilliant. But, if it has to be done, it has to be done. But again, eats into your time. Editing, mixing, mastering can take a number of months, depending on the amount of material and the amount of work it needs. Yeah. Reproduction can take anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks, allow a month to be on the safe side. And that's when you're having something printed like CDs or vinyl or whatever. It can be done very quickly, but there can be delays. And if you have a launch date, you want to make sure you've left yourself enough time. I always advise people to leave a month just to be on the safe side. Fastest turnaround is about 3 months on average. Now that's when recording is really straightforward, and it's just a case of taking out the best takes and doing a little bit of work. You might get it turned around that fast. Generally it's longer, maybe about 6 months, and large projects involving multiple sessions can take longer. It could take years. Some recordings do, things get held up. So it's hard to put a timeline exactly on it, but that's a rough idea. Okay, so in the next time, I'm going to look at what happens during a recording, what happens after a recording. I will look at then, as part of that, editing, mixing and mastering. I'll explain what those things are and what's involved in them. We'll talk about graphic design, what that is, who the graphic designer is, what they do. We'll talk a little bit about reproduction, whether you need to anymore, all those issues. Talk a little bit about releasing, and I will touch on recording in the COVID age. And I know Nick in his talk has been dealing a lot with digital stuff. It's really interesting, the things he was saying. So I'll talk a little bit about that and maybe look at it from the point of view of being a producer and some of my observations of what I see online. So I want to click out of there and do that. Now, there we go, and they're back again. And I see now that there are some questions coming in. Fionn. Yeah. So Fionn is asking, what's worth considering concerning launch tours versus one-off launch gigs? What about a one-off launch gig and then a tour with a reduced band? You could, yeah. It's a great idea to do a launch tour, because you will sell plenty of recordings on a tour. I suppose the question is, can you get the gigs and can you afford to pay the musicians for the tour? At the moment, we're not going to be doing any touring, so there's a whole question around that as to how we're going to manage this. And I know I've seen quite a few things online about releasing in this current climate. But definitely, as I said earlier, absolutely have a launch. Does that answer the question, Fiona? I hope so. And how essential is it to work with a producer who specializes in your music genre? Well, I think the producer needs to understand the music that you're playing. Um, it's a tricky one that, like, there's a whole skill set that comes with producing. There are certainly, for me personally, there are certain things that I wouldn't do because I'd admit to not knowing enough about. There are other areas that mightn't be my area, but because of my experience as a musician and all the other things that go with being, that bring you to the point of being a producer, I think it might be, I would take on projects that mightn't necessarily be in my own area. So it's a tricky one to answer. It's a tricky one to answer. I'll think more on that and come back to you on Thursday. I know there was another question from Holly, and that was about people editing. Yes, people get involved in the editing. Yes, some musicians do. Some musicians like to be very involved in the editing. Some musicians like to come into the studio and sit beside you and talk through it. Some musicians like to take off the material and do some listening to it and maybe take some of the sections and just I'll tell you, come back and tell you which takes to use. Some musicians are very happy to just let you do the editing, and then maybe we'll review that and come back with some suggestions. Some musicians listen to the edits and go, great, and that's the end of that. And that's when you know you've done your job right, when there aren't any too many revisions to be done. So it very much depends on the musician and the relationship the musician has with the producer or the engineer that they're working with. Any more questions? Is there any style of music more complex to record than others? Well, I don't know that there's any style more complex to record. I mean, the more musicians and the more instruments that you have, the more complex it is for the engineer, I suppose. In terms of musicality, yes, I suppose some things are more complicated than others. Again, it comes back to what your particular area is. So my background is in early music, so I would find an early music project probably the easiest thing for me to do, if I was doing some rock music or something, because I totally understand that music. Some more complex music from a technical point of view, from the playing, they can be tricky to do because they're just even processing them can be hard. But each project would have its own complications and its own merits. So yeah, I think. Um, Fionn, when discussing recording in the COVID age, could you please give some advice from home recordings? Um, yes, I will do that, and I'm going to probably do that on Thursday, because I'm going to deal a little bit with the recording at home situation. Um, but I think the main point I would probably make about it is to be critical of yourself, of what you're putting out, in terms of, really do the research. We all have to experiment. We're all trying to find our way through this situation. But before you put anything out online, I think it's a good idea to have a good look at it and maybe ask someone else to have a look at it, and see what they think, to decide whether it's actually worth putting it out. If it's going to help you in any way, maybe you're just doing it for the crack, and that's great. But if you're sort of doing it because you want it to lead to something else, it's a good idea to have some peer review, I would suggest. Now, I wonder, are there anything else anybody wants to ask me? I don't see anything yet. Okay, so I will just say the one thing as I was thinking there that I didn't mention about in the very first slide when I was talking to you about preparing and thinking about what kind of recording you want to do. One thing I didn't mention was just in relation to video recording, and if you have video people coming in, it's a good idea to plan that into recording as well, because when you're in the recording session and it's difficult and you're tired and really concentrating, and then maybe you mightn't have the energy for the filming as well. So if you're planning filming, it's a good idea to have that as an added thing that you can give your full attention to, because you don't want to have a video from a live recording where you're maybe a bit stressed looking. So have a think about that. Right, I don't see anything else coming up at me, so I think that will be me for the minute. And apologies again for the slightly late start. I'll endeavour to be on time on Thursday. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send them on, or do please send me a message if you like. I have a Facebook page of my own, Laoise O'Brien, and you can send me a message if you want to ask me something that you don't want to ask me here online. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I will see you on Thursday.